It's always funny, then it quiets down. Uh, Welcome to the Keston Center Fall Conversation. I'm Jeffrey Archer, Dean of University Libraries, Museums, and Press. And the Fall 2025 Keston Conversation, Ending Persecution, Charting a Path to Global Religious Freedom with Knox Thames and Joanne Cummings. Excited you're here. When you think of all of the things that libraries do, the types of collections that we have, what a special place we have in the world to have a library like the Keston Center. I don't want to overlook that, and what better place for it to be than Baylor. And as we think about our Baylor in deeds and what the Keston Center is able to facilitate, we're in a very blessed environment. And then what better thing to do but in libraries, because we more than just collect things to put on shelves or provide links to databases and journals. This is the place where it's important that we have authors and dialogue on topics live. We have an opportunity to engage with ideas, engage with people, and again, what better place to do that than the library? This lecture is being live streamed and recorded for later viewing. When we do go to question and answer, there will be a catchbox microphone that will be passed around so that your question can be heard, and we will take questions online as well. So now I will call forward Baylor Chaplain and Dean of Spiritual Life, Charlie Ramsey, and Associate Professor Kathy Hillman, Director of the Keston Center for Religion, Politics, and Society, for remarks about spiritual life and Keston. First, Kathy.
Thank you, Dean Archer. Well, quite simply put, the Keston Center for Religion, Politics, and Society at Baylor exists because of religious persecution and the heart and passion of one man. God called Michael Bordeaux in his day, a call that persists in our day because religious persecution continues to impact every faith somewhere in this world. In 1959, as an Oxford student, Michael took part in the first exchange program between Great Britain and the Soviet Union. While studying at Moscow University, he witnessed the start of Nikita Khrushchev's anti-religious campaign. On a later visit, Michael saw further destruction of churches, learned of religious persecution, and met believers who asked him to be our voice where we cannot be heard. Bordeaux took up their call to be the voice of the voiceless, and in 1969 in England founded what became Keston College. Keston gathered reliable information about the situation with all religions and documented the persecution and fight by dissident believers. A vast library and archive formed Keston's core, and the Keston News Service produced authenticated reports that promoted public awareness and exerted positive public political pressure. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, Keston experienced a decline in donations. In 2003, when the news service ceased, the search began for a location for its stunning collection on religious persecution and religious freedom. That included photographs, significant archival and audiovisual materials, in addition to illegally published materials called samizdat. You learned a new word today, most of you. Propaganda posters, art, trial transcripts, and much more, written in at least 33 different languages and encompassing more than 30 discrete denominations and religions. Oxford's Keston Institute accepted Baylor's proposal and in 2007 passed its library and archives to the newly formed Keston Center to work with Keston UK to be a voice for the voiceless through lectures and special events and by promoting research, teaching, and understanding of religion and religious persecution as the center preserves, expands, and makes available the Keston Archives and Library. Today's Ending Persecution conversation honors Reverend Dr. Canon Michael Bordeaux's legacy, and as British Lord David Alton reminds us, In a world of information overload, we must ensure that these stories, today's and yesterday's, do not disappear. Charlie.
Thank you, Professor Hillman. My warmest greetings to everyone who's with us here and online. Being a voice to the voiceless is at the heart of the vision for Baylor University in our Office of Spiritual Life. It is consistent with our understanding of the gospel and our Baptist tradition and our Christian faith. Within my office, we have, yes, our chapel, which we're probably best known for, also our pastoral care, but we also have the Office of Missions and Service and Public Life. And of course, mission is where we're partnering with churches and others around the world, but also in service, locally and abroad. And the last piece, in public life, we want to equip students and promote the work of faculty and researchers to be active in speaking of matters of faith within the public square. So today, our office, MSPL, Mission, Service, and Public Life, is a proud sponsor of this event. I happen to know Knox Thames personally, and so when I saw that he was going to be in Dallas this week, speaking at Dallas Baptist University for a conference there that they had, which was advocating for the freedom of religion for all, right? They were defending persecution against all. I thought, what a great opportunity to invite him to come up the road and be with us here at Baylor. I had the joy of reviewing Knox's book for Princeton Journal last year, and it really alerted to me the crucial time for conversations such as this. If you followed the development of freedom of religion and belief as an issue within State Department and U.S. policy, you can see a clear trajectory of investment, of it becoming an issue. But in the current regime, in the current state of affairs, there's less interest and there's less support. And so now more than ever, there's a call for us to be aware of what can be done, what has been done, and also what is ours yet to do. So I'm so thankful that you are here. I would also like to welcome Professor Cummings, and they're going to be introduced in a minute by Landon Self. So I'm not taking their space, but I just want to say I've had the joy of teaching with Professor Cummings within our BIC program here, and what an incredible opportunity for students to spend time in class and in travel and opportunities learning from her experience and perspective. And it's moments like these that make me very, very proud to be at Baylor University. So let me also extend my welcome to you today. So thank you so much. Now, President of our student body, Mr. Landon Self, please come forward.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ramsey, and my name is Landon Self, and I have the honor of serving as the student body president here at Baylor, and I'm originally from Pflugerville, Texas, so just down the highway, and I actually aspired to attend Baylor since I was a little kid, and so moments like this just mean a lot to me, especially when I get to introduce two remarkable guests with us today. So first we have Joanne Cummings, who is the daughter of a diplomat and actually was raised in various places across the Middle East. She's a retired foreign service officer from the U.S. Department of State, and she has led and has held important leadership positions at U.S. embassies in the region. Mrs. Cummings is a graduate of American University of Beirut, where she earned her Bachelor of Arts in History and then earned her master's degree at UT Austin. And she is currently an adjunct professor here at the university, where she teaches courses about political geography and Middle Eastern affairs. And I had the privilege of learning from Professor Cummings this past semester in her political geography class. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to not only learn from her about academics, but also hear about her experiences. And I must say she had some very interesting and entertaining stories of her time abroad. And then we also are joined today by Knox Thames, and Knox is a globally recognized human rights lawyer, advocate, and author whose career spans over 2 decades, where he has advocated for religious freedom for all. He continues this vital work as a senior fellow at Pepperdine University, where he leads a program on global faith and inclusive societies. And through research, storytelling, and policy engagement, his efforts foster interfaith understanding and promote pluralism worldwide. And so it is my pleasure to introduce to you Joanne Cummings and Knox Thames.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, and yes, our microphones are working. Can everyone hear? All right, great. When I knew that I'd have this opportunity, I was thrilled because in my own life, I have experienced not just the pleasure of understanding different kinds of religious practice, but also seeing the tensions that can arise often when differences are deliberately exacerbated. And in your book, you talked a great deal about that, and I hope that's something that you will lean toward in your discussion. But first, I'd like to ask you, what was your motivation for writing the book?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question, and thank you to Baylor and Keston and Charlie for inviting me here. It's great to be here in Waco. I live in Washington, D.C., but I'm married into a family of Baylor grads, so this place is near and dear. My first book was published by Baylor University Press, and this past weekend, my wife and I were cheering for Baylor to beat TCU, but we're disappointed, like I'm sure all of you were. But this issue of religious persecution is something I've dealt with my entire career. I spent 20 years in government in different diplomatic roles at the State Department and other special commissions, focused on ways that the United States could promote this core American value and core human right of religious freedom for everybody. But these challenges that we were encountering while in government were so monumental, so overwhelming. I was very fortunate to receive a grant from the Templeton Religion Trust to have time to reflect on that, to think about what I'd experienced over my career and try to define the problem more precisely, and then talk about ways that the United States and others who care about this can lean into the issue, hopefully to end persecution, but at least begin ending it, which can have a whole host of goods. In addition to, people mustn't live in fear of discrimination or violence for what they believe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I noticed in this book that, first, congratulations on the way you sort of crafted it.
Oh, thank you.
Because I love the combination of narrative and lessons and summary. Beautifully done.
Oh, thank
so
you.
I just want to pass
you.
that on to you, and everyone else should read the book. But you talked a significant amount about crises that were related to religion in different places and how the American government did or did not, more often the latter, respond effectively. You had some interesting ways of structuring, this is what we're looking at and this is what we can do. Could you go into that a little bit?
So the Pew Research Center has done some really fabulous survey work, and they report pretty consistently that roughly 2 out of 3 people on earth live in a country that restricts the free practice of faith. And that's really an astounding statistic, that 2 out of 3 people live in an environment where they're susceptible to persecution because of the way society has been constructed by government or religious leaders, that there are these very narrow lanes of permissible religious activity. If you question the lanes, want to change lanes, want to lead the road altogether, you'll face prosecution by your government or persecution by your neighbor or both. And so this challenge seems overwhelming, and it is, but to try to break it down into specific typologies was a goal of the book. If we're going to try to solve this problem, we need to understand the nuances. Aspirin's not going to cure cancer. We need specific responses to specific situations. So I developed 4 typologies of religious persecution. The first is authoritarian persecution. This is when a government uses the power of the state to attack, crush, repress religious activity that's they deem impermissible or illegal. The second typology is on the other end of the spectrum. It's extremist persecution. This is when non-state actors, people in the society, rally mobs to lynch individuals, to burn down their churches, their homes, or places of worship out of some perceived religious transgression. The third form is persecution in a democracy, where a large or majority religious community will use the power of the ballot box to transform their beliefs into law and then have the police them. And then the last form is probably the one you're thought of first, is terrorism. This is when a group like ISIS is willing to use extreme violence to force their ideology over an entire society. And so in the book, I have a chapter on each of these, and then there are corresponding chapters that talk about country specifics with examples of what we tried to do when I was in government. So authoritarian, the country I spend the most time talking about is China and what's happening with the Uyghur Muslim community. I joke, but it's true that the Trump and Biden administrations didn't agree on much of anything, but they both did determine that China is committing a genocide against the Uyghur Muslim community. But they're not alone. Christians are being persecuted. You might have heard there was a pastor who was arrested 10 days ago, along with 20 other church workers, Tibetan Buddhism. So I talk about how China is doing that in ways the United States has tried to counter that. Extremism, I look at Pakistan, a country that is near and dear to both of us, and how the case of Asia Bibi, which you might have heard of, this Christian woman who was sentenced to death for blasphemy because of a mob that was rallied, but also the situation of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, this unique expression of Islam and how they're horribly persecuted. For democracy, India, the world's largest, and how the current political leadership is part of this chauvinistic Hindu nationalism movement that's had a devastating impact for Indian Muslims and Indian Christians. And then with terrorism, I spent a lot of time on Iraq. And when I was at the State Department in a special envoy role, we were grappling with the aftermath of the ISIS invasion and what it meant for Yazidis. If you remember that people group that ISIS attempted to wipe out, and also Christians and other unique faiths that have long lived in Iraq, what worked, what didn't, to help them reestablish life. So the hope is that this will help policymakers now be able to see the nuances and then think about how to leverage all the tools of statecraft and influence that we have to push back against this.
And I know that you had, you expressed a fair amount of frustration as you went through your career with how difficult it was to get synergy, to get understanding, to get people to really bring the different aspects of government power to bear on this question. And I have a personal question for you, because although you did refer to these as separate things, it seemed to me sometimes they were conflated. So I'm going to toss my confusion to you. And that is, do you see a total continuum, or how would you divide questions of, this is my faith, this is what I believe, I want to be able to convert, I want to be able to express my faith, but it's my faith, as opposed to my identity as a religious group, which may be something I lead with, it may be something other groups lead with it in identifying me, but is more wrapped up in region, class,
Culture,
ethnicity, race, and all the rest of it. So how do you see those things interacting?
Yeah, that's a key question. I'll answer your first comment first about just the frustrations. I will say, as Americans, first off, we should all be incredibly proud that the U.S. government, for at least a quarter of a century, if not since World War II, has been the leading voice for human rights and religious freedom around the world, bar none. Our Canadian friends, our European friends, they also care about these things. These are our shared values. But I've saw time and time again that if the United States didn't engage, good things just didn't happen, or it was a lot harder. We are the indispensable nation when it comes to a values agenda in the international context, and we should be proud of that. I mean, we have more diplomats focused on international religious freedom than I think all the other European diplomats that look at this combined. And that's a great reflection on who we are as a country. It's a great reflection on our values. That being said, there was always a challenge of the disconnect between the effort to get good language and seeing action follow up. When you're doing human rights work in the State Department, you're really the ethics department for U.S. foreign policy. You're the little angel on the shoulder saying, there could be a different way to do this. Do we need to give them the arms without any quid pro quos, or there's still a lot of people in jail? And you have to get used to losing a lot of policy battles, but you don't have to like it, and you can keep pushing. and that's part of the tension. But when you would get the good statement made, the next step is to follow through so that there's consequences. And there's been this bipartisan tradition of avoiding the hard choices that lead to consequences. And I think that's where, Americans of goodwill, Christians, Baptists, we need to insist that if we really care about these values, if we want them expressed in how our country is represented overseas, that we see this really lived up. Because if we say religious freedom matters and nothing changes, then that erodes our credibility, that destroys any kind of human rights deterrence, and it does a disservice to those who are truly suffering because the bad guys realize they can get away with it. On this issue of identity, yeah, I mean, religion is such a personal thing, and it's hard, it's really impossible to draw broad generalities to your question. It's very specific, really down to the individual. There are, group identities. I was born a Chaldean Catholic or a Faili Kurd, and those are powerful identities. I often joke when I'm in these other settings, I would cite that, my wife's a Texan. And that's a really powerful identity that she carries with her everywhere. And so I get this sort of group identity, and that's never going to change, even though she's lived in Virginia longer than she's lived in Texas. But at the same time, international human rights law established by the UN with strong American influence recognizes the individual right of freedom of conscience, the right to have any faith or none, to share that faith, to change faith. But that's often a right respected in the breach. But we're thankful that there are these UN documents because they set a common yardstick to measure government action. I was often asked, were you trying to export the First Amendment? And I'd be like, no. First Amendment's been great for us, but we are our history is so unique and so different. We're looking to the common standard established by the United Nations that over 192 countries have signed up to. A lot of them didn't mean it, but they did. But that still is a point to start the conversation. We share theoretically, these values in common, and let's talk about the problems.
I was just thinking that it's an echo of a joke that used to be around in the past. Maybe other countries should use our First Amendment because we're not. So you have talked about in your speaking and your writing the kind of challenge in the United States of really reaching for religious freedom for all, freedom to believe or not to believe for all, where there are many groups in the United States that have focused primarily and been willing to fund and pass laws to protect Christians in other countries. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with that, but you make a strong case that unless we are pushing for religious freedom for all, it's not going to work for any. Yeah. Can you walk through the logic on that?
So first, if I was still a policymaker, the argument I would make is if an environment where everyone has freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief without fear of discrimination or violence, there are studies that prove that those countries are going to be more stable, more prosperous, better partners to the United States because we're going to share common values. And there is overwhelming evidence that when this right isn't respected, it's a driver of extremism, instability. Why are people running to our southern border where they're running from something? It's often religious persecution. And so these create factors that engage us eventually. Mm-hmm. So I've always said religious freedom is an issue that actually reflects American values and American interests. Mm-hmm. It's an American value. It's part of our founding credo. We've done our best to live it out over 250 years. But it's truly a remarkable thing what we have here. And it reflects our interests because of these realpolitik type matters. When we ignore it, bad things happen that get more expensive to fix later. As someone who tries to take the Christian faith seriously as best I can, now that I'm out of government, I've been thinking and writing about, okay, as a Christian, what is our motivation to advocate for all? Mm-hmm. And in fact, that's why I was up at Dallas Baptist University to have a conference to bring Christians together to talk about what does it mean to love our neighbor. And I think, as I read the Bible, that we're called to seek justice. Isaiah 1:17, Micah 6:8. That's not limited to one group or one time. We're commanded to love our neighbor, and that is the hero of that story, the Good Samaritan. I only recently realized this, that for first century listeners, that was a huge twist in the story, because Samaritans were considered religiously and ethnically different. And for Jesus to put that twist in, that's like, Coach Aranda broke down on 35W and the TCU coach helped him. That's that kind of, you wouldn't expect it, right? So we're commanded to love our neighbor. And then we're commissioned to go to all the world to share about Jesus Christ. And if people are in jail, if they're suffering, it's up to us to help alleviate that suffering, because we believe in human dignity. We believe in the Imago Dei. We know that God loves everyone. And how can we ignore them? It just breaks everything that our faith is founded on. So we've been trying to make the case to inspire Christians to a broader view of this, where of course we advocate for our own, and we don't do a good enough job for that, but we also advocate for the persecuted neighbor. And I'm sure you saw that when Christians are persecuted, it's rarely just Christians. And if we're taking the calling, the commandment, and the commission seriously, we need to be that voice. Because otherwise, our statements that God loves you and I want to talk to you about that rang pretty hollow if we've ignored them in some prison because they're not one of us. And I think that's the challenge. And I've got some cards here I'll leave on the table. We've created a little network to provide some Bible studies and prayer guides, just if you're intrigued by this, to help equip you into how can you have a broader view of prayer and advocacy for everyone as an expression of this.
I love that. I remember the first time I went to Iraq to work on recovering local governance was in 2003. And I came back to Cairo, where I'd been living, and I was meeting with several church leaders. And the question they asked was, how is this part of your Christian witness? And I found that an interesting question, because I am out there doing stuff in a war zone, and I'm not particularly thinking about my Christian witness. I am thinking about my faith as it sustains me. And then I realized that in many cases, our witness is taking care of people. Our witness is caring for people who are different from us, who are in jail, who are hungry. If any of you were at the Jackson lecture, you heard Governor Beasley talk, talking about the vital nature of caring for the poor and hungry in the world for Christians, not so that they convert, but because they are also in the image of God. Do you think that there are ways that we can approach questions of mission, particularly for students, that feed into what you're talking about?
Yeah, I would encourage students to think about studying international relations, international law. The fields are white with the harvest, but the workers are few. And I talk about this pandemic of persecution that's impacting every faith somewhere. And there are opportunities for you to get engaged. Every morning, we should thank God that we live in the United States of America in the 21st century. And we've been blessed. We have such blessings of liberty and prosperity. We've got our challenges, absolutely, but a bad day in America beats a good day in Pakistan or China or Russia. And so because we're here now, we have this opportunity to leverage our citizenship to be a voice for these others out of, as an American value, as a Christian conviction, both. Let your congressman and senator know that you care about this. I've lived in Washington, D.C. for a long time, and we've seen a real erosion, weakening in political interest in this topic. I think it's because people out here just, they're not letting their congressman know. And they're driven by that. There was a survey that came out, or a study that said, if a congressman receives a letter requesting a meeting and it has 10 signatures on it, physical signatures, like it's 90% of the time, those people will get the meeting. It doesn't take much. And ask them, what are you doing? Are you tracking what's going on in Pakistan and China and Russia? Are you speaking out? We want you to do that. And they need to hear that. If they don't, they're going to go to the group that's making the noise. Secondly, if you're a Christian or a person of faith, you can pray. We have access to the God of the universe. You know, pray for God to provide rescue and protection. This network we've established of Christians who share this, we're going to have a day of prayer on November 1st, just to try to bring people together to pray for those who are facing persecution, our Christian brothers and sisters and others. And then lastly, look around you. I mean, the world, everybody is everywhere, and the world is here, even in Waco. Ask God to give you a heart to see others around who may be suffering. Maybe they're an international student and they fled a situation of persecution, or maybe they have family members who are in a tough place. I had this encounter in the Walmart checkout lane last year where the woman swiping the groceries, she looked to me to be a Uyghur Muslim. And I just kind of felt called to ask. I said, are you a Uyghur? And she was a little surprised, said, yes, I am. And I just said, how's your family? I know it's really hard. And she was so taken back that this stranger cared enough to ask. And that was the end of the exchange. I don't know what happened next. But I kind of felt like it was giving a cool cup of water on a hot day to someone. And that was easy, but she was seen. And there are people like that everywhere in the United States. And that's a very tangible act, even though, thank God, you're very far away from the persecution the book talks about. There are people here that are connected to it. And are you just simply asking? That's a really easy first step you can take.
I remember last year, I had a student from Gaza, a student whose family was all in Gaza, and I had a student whose family was all in Lebanon, and both of them were, you know, constantly hearing from home about death and loss. And there are so many places like that in the world. I mean, it's one reason people are showing up at our southern border, because there are so many places like that. When you talk about religious freedom being tied into stability, being tied into openness and a respect for pluralism and rights of women and all these things, would you make the argument that for the security and economic stability of the United States, we need to be advocating for religious freedom in other places?
I mean, absolutely. President Trump's sort of foreign policy goals of wanting to have a safe, secure, and prosperous America. I mean, we all agree with that. And I think this is where issues of religious freedom, religious persecution, human rights actually help advance that. Mm-hmm. You know, we're going to have a more secure America if other countries aren't becoming inundated with terrorist activity that are forcing people to flee, that then flood or overwhelm our southern border, or create the metastasizing social issues that lead to terrorism that attack American interests and businesses. And we're going to be more prosperous if countries respect human rights. Like, how can we trust China to uphold any trade deal if they're disappearing pastors and putting Uyghurs in concentration camps? I mean, come on. And so incorporating our values into our foreign policy, we have the ability to advance these core security and rights values in a way no other country can. Mm-hmm. And it's hard, it's sloppy, it's 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, 1 step sideways. But when we don't do it, if we pull out, if we say this is too complicated, the burdens of global leadership are too heavy, they're going to find us anyway. Mm-hmm. And it's foolish to think otherwise. So I've been hoping, and in the conversations I have with friends in the Trump administration, is we need to be stronger on this. And I served in the first Trump administration. We did incredible things on international religious freedom. We convened 2 summits in Washington, created an International Religious Freedom Alliance. And I haven't seen that carry over to the second administration. And that's the conversation. Like, how do we encourage that commitment that was there in the first to carry over in the second, either because it's American value or because of these three priorities, that they meet both. The evidence is there. We just need the political will to be found. And this is where you all can be helpful. You don't underestimate your voice to ask our government to be better on this.
You mentioned several cases in your writing. You talked about China and the Uyghurs, and that has been easier for the United States government to recognize as a genocide, particularly because it does meet that standard about blocking reproduction or taking children away. We've had much more trouble with Burma. I'm thinking back to Cambodia in the past, where there were strong political reasons for us not wanting to recognize it there. We have issues in the Middle East other than the Yazidis, where again, American policy is making it difficult to recognize what's on the ground. But I was thinking of Bahrain. And Bahrain is a small set of islands off the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf. And the population is a majority Shia Muslim and a minority Sunni Muslim, but the government has long been Sunni Muslim. So during Arab Spring, we saw in Bahrain real frustration from people who were not doing as well as they should be, who wanted more openness, who wanted more freedom. A lot of those were Shia, but not all. But the government turned that into a question of the Shia are being dominated by Iran. It's because they're Shia. It's not because anything is wrong. And it became very, very violent. I can remember sitting in meetings where we were saying, look, because of the way they're treating demonstrators, we need to slow down on the weapons that we're selling them. And of course, there were deep military goals that related to Bahrain, and there was always a waiver. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned waivers in several situations. So, you know, when we either refuse to recognize a religious component or when we securitize the religious component, as the Ottomans did against the Armenians, how do we address that? Because if you write to someone in Congress and say, this is really important, and they say, oh, but we got much bigger issues there. Yeah. How do you break through that wall?
If you're writing Congress, keep it really simple. But I think this is where, you know, numbers count. The more friends and colleagues you can get to sign the letter, to do the call. For example, one of our partners at this conference up in Dallas is a group called Christian Solidarity Worldwide. They're based out of the UK, and they advocate for everybody. And they're very concerned about what's happening in Nicaragua. There were 3 Christian workers who have been disappeared by the Ortega regime. And they actually, if you go to the website, if you Google Christian Solidarity Worldwide, they have a website for this case where you can type in your zip code, your name, and it will email your congressman and senator a letter saying, please raise with the Ortega regime, where are these 3 people? And so they're trying to make it easy to get like mass numbers to members of Congress. You know, phone calls, they are diligently recorded down. It's not easy work. It's hard to kind of get the enough heft and oomph to break through when there's so many other competing interests. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And I think too often, even with myself, it's like, well, what's my one voice going to do? But you don't know. Maybe the one voice would work. Maybe you'll pick up the phone that's answered by a sympathetic staffer that might have a connection. You just don't know. So I would encourage you to push. But I was also thinking about your description of the royal family in Bahrain and this idea of, you know, for an authoritarian government, you know, their time horizon is not 10 years, 1 year, 1 month, 1 week. It's that I'm alive and in power when I wake up tomorrow morning. And so their whole worldview is just so different from ours because it's about regime survival at the end of the day. Now, they'll dress it up with other things. I think this, again, is where U.S. influence can change the calculation of, especially in an authoritarian situation, decisions that are made. Because they all have their domestic constituencies that are pushing for a certain answer and outcome. And if we can say there's going to be a cost, that can shift the balance of power. So thinking of just the Keston work, I talk about Uzbekistan in the book, former Soviet republic, and how we were able to credibly threaten a consequence for the jailing of thousands of Muslims, the closing of churches, an oppressive religion law. And we saw change, we saw progress, because we had a carrot and a stick, and they perceived the stick to be credible. And that got them to do things that they otherwise wouldn't have done. Uzbekistan is still far from perfect, but it's a lot better than it was. And the fascinating thing was, once they were taken off this special designation list the State Department has, Saudi Arabia and Tajikistan both approached me and said, how do we get that? How do we get off this blacklist that we've been on for decades? I'm like, well, you have to do some stuff. But there wasn't, with those, there wasn't that credible threat to incentivize them to do the hard things like open a church somewhere in Saudi Arabia for the expat community, for example, that would push them across the line.
And it's interesting because the countries around Saudi Arabia, every country around Saudi Arabia, has churches. And in the Emirates and Oman and Qatar and Kuwait, the government has built religious complexes for different churches. And it's interesting, though, because in that case, it is not a question of we are facilitating religious practice of Omanis who are Christian. It is we have people from other parts of the world, and we think they have a right to practice their religion. It's not encouraging people shifting among religions.
Still prohibited, in fact. So.
Well, that's one way of saying not encouraged. So, you can have a very profound discussion about interfaith cooperation in a place that prohibits conversion. But we want people of different faiths to be able to work together. So, is conversion an absolutely essential element in religious freedom, or is it not?
In my view, if a country criminalizes, punishes conversion, you can't say there's full religious freedom. Mm-hmm. And I also talk about how religious freedom is a bundled right, in that it's not just the right to worship, there's actually lots of components to it that make it unique. So if you go to church on Sunday, just think about there's a whole bunch of rights you rely upon. Of course, there's freedom to believe in God or higher power. There's freedom of speech to hear the sermon. But you also have to have freedom of movement to get to church on time. You need to have freedom of expression if you're Jewish or Muslim, to wear some type of garb as an outward expression. There needs to be, of course, freedom of conscience to believe in God or change or follow, in addition to some type of legal recognition so that you can incorporate to then have property rights, to have a place of worship. So we often say that religious freedom is the canary in the coal mine for the health of an overall human rights environment, because of its bundled nature, its multifaceted nature. But without the right to convert, without true freedom of conscience, it's a hollow right. I'm not sure it's there, because if you don't have this sole freedom, and this is where international legal scholars have talked about, there's a difference between external activity, which governments can regulate and limit in some circumstances, and internal religious activity, which governments have no right to ever touch, ever. The internal is sacred. But that's what governments are afraid of, ideas, new beliefs that challenge their hold on power, their constituencies that keep them in power, or just have a religious animus against other thoughts and ways of living. So it's a complicated, nuanced issue. I'd often reference my own experience growing up in small town Kentucky, where, as you can guess by my name, we started out Presbyterian. Middle school, we converted to Southern Baptist, went to the church next door, had a good youth group, and there was a social cost for my parents. Like they said, people stopped talking to them. So we should recognize that conversion is not painless. It causes social friction, social breakage, and this is where the communal versus individual tensions come into play. But to punish someone for what they believe or don't believe is something I hope the United States will always speak out against. And I think it's something as Christians we should always speak out against.
Thank you. The question of conversion is particularly important in countries that don't believe you can leave the religion. And Judaism has its own history of this in the sense that for many families, if you leave the faith, you're dead.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you think that Eastern religions like Buddhism or Hinduism, Confucianism it is my experience that they're more flexible, except in the case of, for instance, Sri Lanka and Myanmar, where it has become very tied to national identity. But do you think that Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, are less comfortable with a fluidity than religions that are not Abrahamic faiths?
I haven't thought about that. That's interesting. I can see where in the Abrahamic family, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, they're, with the exception of Judaism, both Islam and Christianity are, seeking new adherents. But I know from our own faith that we recognize freedom of conscience. I know from my Muslim friends that despite how some Muslim majority governments organize their society around this prohibition, that they would say actually the founder of the faith recognized the ability to change, but it's sort of the politics that prevent them from recognizing it because of extremists or far-right conservatives in their society. And so when I was in government, it's like, how do we find these voices from within those communities that can make the argument to their people and their language with their scriptures? Because it's not for me as a white American guy to cite as Quranic scriptures.
Rarely productive.
I tried it once, it didn't go well. But to have authentic expressions of Islam that have this broader view. And this is where the American Muslim community were such great partners in this, because they get it. They're Americans. They share this value. No one likes it when people leave your faith. Like, I want people to become Christians as much as they want me to become a Muslim. And I joke that, you can believe I'm going to hell, you just can't do anything to send me there. So, and if we can be honest about, like, we have different truth claims that do compete. And while we have shared values, these ultimate questions are different, but we can disagree agreeably. And it's so important now in the US and around the world that we find ways to stand in solidarity with each other, despite different worldviews and views of the hereafter, that we recognize you have the right to believe what you want, you have the right, you have the right, you have the right, I have the right, and we agree on that. And that's where we've seen progress. When we have these multi-faith coalitions, those are unique, and that's hopeful. And despite all the junk going on, there are these multi-faith coalitions coming around that give me cause to be optimistic.
Thank you. And I can see that Charlie wants to, hold on, because I want to ask one more thing. So because you want to shift this over to question time, this is simply the first question of question time. It's all
Savvy diplomat here.
When you talk about democracies that move away from religious freedom and the ways that can happen, often it is sort of exploitation of worship frameworks or creating anger and hatred toward the other for political reasons. And we can pick out lots of places. India is a great example. Should we worry about that here?
The fusing of religion and politics? Yeah, of course. I mean, we have separation of church and state, and I talk about in the book the history of it and how that informs our diplomatic approach. That it's not to punish religion or prevent religion from touching the state, it's to sort of protect both. But then you have religion and politics are always going to be intermixing, and we don't want to exclude people from the public square because they're motivated by their religious beliefs. They have the right to talk about these things. But, you know, politicians using religion, you know, painting religion over a secular goal to win the support or votes of others is as old as human history. You know, I've studied the 30 Years' War in Europe in 1864, and that was Catholics fighting Protestants and Protestants fighting Protestants and Catholics fighting Catholics. And maybe at the individual level it was a holy war, but like the kings had political agendas that were dressed up as sacred.
Yes.
And I think that's where we need to be informed citizens. And if you're a person of faith, know your faith. And so that when people start to misuse it, abuse it, you know enough to say, that's not right. That's not what we actually believe. That's not what our country's about. And then politely call them out. That's what I hope we can get to.
Thank you. I appreciate your taking that first question. Can I throw it? I love throwing it.
If you're new to Baylor, this is an exciting experience.
Wow.
It won't hurt you, I promise. And if it drops, you won't break it.
If you're new to me, this is.
If we'll have some questions, who would like to ask our first question?
I have a question about if there are students looking for. Thank you, Brooke. This is wonderful. I have a question about religious freedom in developed democracies, specifically in Europe. And here what I'm thinking about are the limitations that some European countries have placed on Muslim women wearing religious garbs, but also the construction of minarets. And apologies, I have not yet read your book, but I will. But I know a lot of the examples that you all brought out were in authoritarian regimes, but I wondered if you had insights or ideas that you might share with us about those kinds of restrictions on religious freedom that we see in our peer countries.
My first job in this space was focusing on religious freedom issues in Europe and the former Soviet Union. And that's when there was this effort in France and also Belgium to limit the rights of Muslim women to wear the headscarf, the hijab. And I took it upon myself to go to Paris to talk to the French about it, you know, because I'm a hardworking person. But, and it was fascinating to talk to the French because they have this sort of different mentality. They call it laïcité, and it's really freedom from religion. And so they want to have like a religiously empty public space. And they have this large immigrant population. Well, you know, white French people don't really go to church except on Easter and Christmas. Immigrant population, predominantly Muslim, very devout, and they don't know what to do with it. And this has sort of fueled this far-right sentiment to say, well, let's just say girls can't wear headscarves in school. Schools have to be religiously neutral. And also you can't wear a yarmulke or a large cross. So this law had the appearance of neutrality. But everyone in France knew that if you're a Christian and were motivated to wear a large cross, you were in a Catholic school, and none of the Jewish kids went to public school, they went to their Jewish schools. So it was really targeting Muslim girls. And I would talk to French policymakers and say, if you really want to reach these students with the values of liberty, fraternity, and equality, you want them in school. And if you're making them choose between their faith and their religion, they're going to choose their religion. And then they're just gone. And they just couldn't process that. And
Between school and faith, you mean?
well, they couldn't process that someone would love their faith that much. And, well, why just take it off? And they would make arguments of, like, women's equality, like this is subjugating women. Well, I'm like, well, frankly, I think
Telling them they can't wear
passing a
it.
law, you know, this is like Saudi Arabia in reverse, where
Right.
Saudi Arabia, you're forced to wear it. And it's the same challenge. So I think this is where it gets tied into migration issues, ethnicity, they don't know how to integrate people, and religion becomes this sort of outward visible sign of we don't know how to deal with this challenge.
Hi. Oh, this is a mic? Oh, I didn't know.
It's not just
Oh,
permission to speak.
I like this mic. Great. My name is Fuad Kuzin. I'm from Iran. I was born in Iran. I left when I was 17 years old, and I experienced a lot of persecution and a lot of prejudices since I was in first grade, or since I remember. But I came here when I was 19. And several of my families, after revolution in Iran, the Islamic Revolution in '79, they applied for religious asylum, and they were accepted, and all of them are very successful businessmen, physicians, professors, and so on. My question to you is that lately, my cousin's son, he was accepted at UT Arlington because Baha'is are forbidden to go to higher education in Iran. They can finish high school, but they cannot attend university. So he exited. We went to Turkey and got a visa, student visa, to come to UTA. But he lately received a letter that his asylum, he applied for asylum, that his asylum status was put on hold. It's paused. My question is this about from any minority coming from Muslim countries, or is it certain religions? Because there are some exceptions, as I understand, for asylum seekers.
Yeah, I am not an expert in asylum law, unfortunately, so I don't know how to answer that specifically. I mean, traditionally, if you come here and you have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of your religion, race, ethnicity, social class, you would be eligible for asylum. We know the Trump administration has a hard line on immigration, so I don't know, but it would seem to be there would be a correlation between the current policies and people applying for this status. But I don't know if you have thoughts.
Yeah, let me toss something in on that. So just so we're on the same ground, seeking asylum is not an illegal crossing of a border. It is a crossing of a border. You go to the authorities and you seek asylum. That's a legal thing. But in the United States, it increasingly became seen as, well, they're undocumented, therefore they're illegal. The problem is that if the administration now wants to take the stand that we can't have all these asylum seekers coming across the border, then we have to recognize less. We have to not recognize asylum as a thing, because then that will set a precedent on the southern border. So I think it is that. I find this very unfortunate, both because of cases like this, but because the United States has always been seen in the world as a place that people can come to be safe. We have not only had lots of immigration in our history, but also we have taken in a large number of refugees. We have provided enormous amounts of funding to the UN High Commission for Refugees. We are pulling back on all of those things now.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one final question. And then afterwards, you'll be able to carry on the conversation. There's snacks, there's time, but I'll bring it to you.
I'd like to ask about the rise of Christian nationalism in our country and how that threatens religious freedom and perhaps is or will lead to covert or overt persecution.
Professor?
Yes.
Could you explain that a little bit more in case there are people that don't know about Christian nationalism?
Okay, well, without going into a deep discussion of Christian nationalism, it is the epitome of politicization of religion, but it also explicitly places one religion above all others. Let me give a very short example from Yemen. This is not Christian nationalism, but after Arab Spring, there was a national dialogue, and one of the issues being discussed was the role of religion in the state. And lots of countries at some point say, what is the relationship? And there were people who said, religion should be stipulated as this is what runs the country, because that's how you have good people, that's how you avoid corruption, that is how everything is good, and we have justice, and we'll be able to fight poverty and all these good things. But other people were saying, but if you say that, who gets to decide what interpretation of, in this case, Islam, is going to be at play? So with Christian nationalism, we not only have an attempt to privilege a certain religion to actually place institutions of government under a certain religion, but we run the risk, in addition to impacts on other religions, which denomination, which flavor, which church leader is going to make the decision about how the Bible is translated and interpreted. So because of my experience in countries that have dealt with it in other places, the very thought of this fills me with sincere dread. I have seen it lead to broad violence. I think it is a bad thing. This is my personal opinion. Don't do this. But that was behind my yes.
And I would just add that there have been many times I've encountered, Christians in other countries talking about the persecution they received that was justified by things happening here or in Europe by Christian governments to these minorities in our context. Mm-hmm. So if anything,
it has an
we shouldn't elevate this because if you care about Christians, because there'll be others that suffer elsewhere. I mean, otherwise, I think it's un-American. It's a misreading of our history. But also this issue, how do we combat it? How do we engage it? This among churches, trying to combat it, Christian nationalism with Christian internationalism. Like this broader view that we are part of a broader kingdom. We're proud Americans, but we're part of Christ and his kingdom. And this is why we're advocating for all. We wish everyone to have the freedom of conscience, this God-given right. And I'm hoping maybe that can be a way to create an off-ramp for folks who, are our friends and neighbors or relatives who we love, that are hearing through their social media feeds or whatever this sort of this enticing idea that it doesn't really work. Here are some other approaches that is actually in line with Scripture and what we believe as Christians and as Americans.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Charlie, for bringing Knox. Thank you, Knox and Joanne, for your very thoughtful conversation. I could have gone quite a bit longer. We will have an opportunity for you to visit with them. There is a book signing if you wish to purchase a book. It's $45. Unfortunately, we can only get it in hard copy today. You can't order it later, but if you want it autographed, now is the time for you to do that. We also thank Dean Archer and Dr. Flavin in the Political Science Department for co-sponsoring with the new Mission Service and Public Life. I don't have all those initials yet in my head, but we do appreciate that. And I'm especially appreciative of the takeaways today. This is the first time I've been to one of these conversations where I left with things that I thought I could do personally. Good. And here's some things that I got from the lecture, just very briefly. Advocate for religious freedom for all people, not just my people and my religion. Incorporate our values into all we do, especially into our foreign policy. Don't underestimate the power of one voice and one voice joined with others. Know your own faith.
pray for those who are religiously persecuted and for our own part in that, especially on November 1st, which is that day of prayer. And finally, and I appreciated you saying this, Knox, see people and give a cool cup of water on a very hot day. And thank you for coming.